Starvation and Silence. Families speak out about jail food abuse for more real crime stories. Be sure to subscribe, like, share, and let's discuss your thoughts in the comments. It began with a scream that echoed through the narrow hallways of the Hinds County Detention Center in Jackson, Mississippi. Guards rushed to the isolation wing, where 36-year-old Michael Richardson was found collapsed beside his bunk, his uniform hanging loosely from a body that had lost nearly 30 pounds in less than 2 months. His cellmate, trembling, whispered through the slot in the door. He told them he hadn't eaten in 3 days. When paramedics arrived, they were too late. Michael was pronounced dead at 6:47 a.m. The coroner's report would list malnutrition and dehydration among the contributing factors. Inside the jail, rumors spread fast. Michael had been put on what inmates called the loaf diet. It was a punishment meal, a dense, tasteless mix of vegetables, flour, and beans, baked into a single brown brick served 3 times a day. The official line was that it met nutritional requirements. But the truth was harder to swallow. Later, when investigators reviewed the kitchen logs, they found entire days marked meal refused, though witnesses said no trays were ever delivered. Surveillance footage revealed the same chilling routine. Officers walking past cells without stopping, clipboards in hand, marking boxes as if meals had been served. When word reached the outside world, the story broke open. Michael's mother, Deborah Richardson, stood in front of reporters, her voice trembling but fierce. "They starved my son," she said. "He wasn't an animal. He was a human being." Her words echoed through national headlines, Starvation and Silence in Mississippi jail. The outcry was immediate. Former inmates began coming forward, telling nearly identical stories: days without food, trays filled with inedible loaf, and guards using hunger as control. One man described watching others trade scraps of bread like currency. Another said he saw an officer laugh while tossing a full tray into the trash. But the real shock came when federal inspectors entered the facility. What they found in the kitchen storage would ignite a scandal. Dozens of unused food cartons labeled for restricted diet, untouched for months. The freezer was nearly empty, and the temperature log hadn't been updated in weeks. The inspection reports painted a devastating picture: spoiled food, falsified records, and a pattern of neglect that stretched back years. But as investigators began connecting the dots, they discovered something even darker. Michael Richardson wasn't the first inmate to die under these circumstances. His was the 5th death in just 3 years linked to food-related discipline. And now, families across Mississippi were demanding answers, ready to speak out about the hunger, the lies, and the silence that had swallowed their loved ones alive. The town of Jackson woke up to headlines that made the state shudder. 5th inmate death linked to food punishment. For months, families who had whispered their pain in private suddenly found their voices echoing across news broadcasts. At the heart of it all stood Deborah Richardson, holding her son's photo outside the courthouse, a candle flickering beside her. "My boy begged for help," she said to cameras. "They left him to starve, and they called it discipline." Her words cracked open the silence. Other families came forward. Linda Cooper, whose brother James had returned home after serving 6 months in the same jail, 50 pounds lighter and permanently diabetic. Angela Brooks, whose teenage son had written letters describing loaf days that left him weak and dizzy. Soon, the families began gathering every Sunday on the courthouse steps, carrying signs with names of their sons and daughters printed in bold black ink. The slogan was simple but powerful: "Feed them justice." Reporters started calling it the Hinds hunger case. Local news crews aired interviews with former inmates who described meal skipping as routine. One ex-inmate, voice disguised, said, "They tell us, y'all act up, you don't eat." It wasn't about rules. It was control. Behind the scenes, investigators from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division had started digging through thousands of pages of jail records. They found that food logs had been falsified to make it appear as if 3 meals a day were served, even when inmates and staff both knew otherwise. In one document, an officer had written "meal refused" next to 10 inmates' names, every one of whom had filed grievances the same week. The deeper they went, the worse it got. Temperature logs in the kitchen were blank for weeks. Old bread and moldy vegetables were being used to feed hundreds of inmates. Several guards admitted under questioning that they had been told to cut meals for troublemakers to keep order. One confessed that officers even competed over who could make inmates complain the least. In a small conference room, a federal investigator reviewed hours of surveillance video. On the screen, a correctional officer passed a tray through a door slot and laughed as he walked away. Later in that same footage, another officer can be seen marking the meal as served. It wasn't just negligence, it was a pattern. A system designed to punish through hunger, wrapped in paperwork and silence. As national media descended on Jackson, the sheriff's office held a press conference claiming isolated misconduct. But that same afternoon, the Clarion Ledger published leaked internal memos from jail administrators that told a different story. One email read, "The loaf diet has proven effective for behavioral control. Continue as directed." The outrage exploded. Protesters filled the courthouse steps, their chants echoing against the stone walls. No more silence. Feed them right. But just as the calls for justice grew louder, a whistleblower came forward, an officer from inside Hinds County Detention Center, holding documents that would shock everyone watching. He claimed the starvation orders came from the top. When the whistleblower, identified only as Officer D. Harris, stepped into the federal courthouse with a stack of sealed folders, the entire state of Mississippi held its breath. Inside those folders were internal directives signed by senior jail officials, approving the use of meal restriction for behavioral management. Each order had initials from the chief jail administrator and, in some cases, notes referencing approval from the sheriff's office. Investigators realized this wasn't the act of a few rogue guards. It was policy. The revelations hit the news like an explosion. Overnight, starvation and silence became a trending phrase across the country. National networks replayed clips of grieving families and footage of the now infamous loaf diet, a brown, shapeless brick sitting cold on a metal tray. The Justice Department announced a civil rights lawsuit against the county, citing cruel and unusual punishment. Inside the courtroom, the tension was suffocating. Rows of families sat shoulder to shoulder, holding framed photos of their loved ones. Some cried quietly. Others stared straight ahead, jaws clenched. When prosecutors presented the evidence, emails, falsified meal logs, temperature charts, and the whistleblower's testimony, the silence was broken only by the sound of paper shuffling and the hum of the overhead lights. Officer Harris took the stand. His voice shook at first, then grew firm. "They told us hunger made inmates easier to manage," he said. "If someone talked back or refused orders, they'd lose their meal. It wasn't about safety, it was punishment." The room fell still. Even the sheriff, seated behind his attorneys, lowered his head. Days later, the jury returned its verdict. Multiple officials found guilty of civil rights violations and falsifying public records. The federal judge called their actions inhumane and unconstitutional. As the decision was read aloud, gasps rippled through the gallery. Deborah Richardson clutched her son's photo and whispered, "You can rest now, Michael." In the aftermath, the Department of Corrections implemented sweeping reforms. The restricted diet policy was permanently banned across Mississippi facilities. Independent food inspectors were assigned to each county jail, with unannounced checks and recorded temperature logs. The new law that emerged from the scandal was unofficially called Michael's Law. Months later, a quiet memorial service was held outside the detention center. Families gathered at sunrise, placing candles along the fence line. A small plaque now hangs on the outer wall, in memory of those silenced by hunger. May their voices never be ignored again. As dawn light glowed blue against the cold steel bars, Deborah stood at the front, surrounded by other mothers. Reporters captured her final words. They tried to break them with hunger, but instead, they fed the truth. Across Mississippi, those words carried weight. The story of starvation had become the story of reform. And though the walls of Hinds County still stand, they no longer hide what they once did because families refuse to stay silent. The silence was broken. The truth was fed.